Hey, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we are going to talk about what to do when somebody emails you and tells you that they found an error in your pattern. Now, there are a lot of things you can do to avoid this, and we've talked about a lot of them. One of them, namely, being getting a really good tech editor to read through your patterns. Tech editors are different than testers. They come up with a different eye, and generally speaking, most people will tell you they are well worth the money. So that's your best barrier defense, but they are still human. And it doesn't matter how good your tech editor is, occasionally they are going to miss things. It's just the way that it is. Now, if your tech editor is missing things all the time, that's a different story. But once in a while, they're human. They may miss something, and you may end up in this situation where you've got a customer emailing you, telling you that they think they found an error in your quilt pattern. So what do you do when that happens? Well, first thing, and this is true for any kind of customer service interaction, is always start sympathetic. Even if they're wrong, which happens a whole lot, right? People will tell you they found an error, and really they just didn't read through the pattern closely enough because they were skimming. But even if that's the case, be sympathetic. You are going to get a much better response from them and a much more pleasant interaction for both of you if you just start by saying, hey, I'm really sorry you're dealing with this. Let's dig in and figure out what's going on, right? That doesn't mean instantly admitting that it's your mistake, even if it's not. We're not about doing that. That's not really helpful. But you do want to be sympathetic because this person is frustrated, right? They paid money for this quilt pattern and they've found something that's preventing them from following it. And they have even caused them to waste fabric or waste a lot of time. They have to sit there and unpick seams, which sucks, right? So be very sympathetic. That is always going to get you a better response for the remainder of the interaction than coming out swinging of like, no, absolutely not. That's not my fault, right? Doesn't help at all. And that kind of comes to the second piece of this is that if you made a mistake, own it, right? There's no harm in making a mistake. We are all human. It's going to happen. Nobody's immune to this. You are not perfect. Nobody is. So if you made a mistake, say that. Hey, I'm really sorry. We did our best to try and prevent this, but things slipped through. I am so sorry. You are absolutely correct. That is a mistake. Here's the solution for it, right? Try to be understanding, right? That's that be sympathetic part. But if you made a mistake, don't try to deny the mistake. Just own it. People are going to respond a whole lot better to that than you trying to just always be defensive. Nobody likes somebody being defensive, especially if they know that you screwed up. Now, that being said, if you didn't make a mistake, you don't need to apologize for something that you didn't do, right? And this is pretty frequent in the quilting industry. You get a lot of people that are like, I didn't understand this pattern, so therefore it's your problem. That's not fair to you. That's not realistic. That's not helpful, right? Because if you didn't make a mistake, you can't actually help them fix the mistake. And you sure as heck don't need to lie and fess up to something you didn't do. That's dumb. Now, that doesn't mean you come back to the customer and say, no, this is your fault. You're just dumb or something along those lines. Like, that's not helpful either, right? But you don't need to feel pressure to basically take responsibility for something that you didn't cause. Now, we've kind of already talked about this next point, which is put yourself in their shoes and try to be as helpful as possible, right? Even if it's not a mistake in your pattern, you can still maybe do some things to help them, right? If they cut pieces wrong and they're trying to figure out how to remedy that because they're out of fabric, you could offer some solutions for that. What solutions? You're gonna have to be creative here. And if you don't have any, that's fine too. But if you can think of something like, hey, you could just sew those all back together and recut your pieces. Or, you know, if you sewed a bunch of them wrong, but they're all consistently wrong, like, hey, it's a design choice. Just go with it, right? There's lots of things that you can suggest there, and that's going to be situation to situation, but just try to be as helpful as possible. Even if it's not your mistake, that's going to give you a much better response from your customer and going to give them a much better experience that'll encourage them to come back to you, especially if it wasn't your mistake. But put yourself in their shoes, right? They have purchased a quilt pattern that was supposed to give them a design that they probably fell in love with, right? That's why they purchased the darn thing. They've got big dreams about how this thing's going to look amazing and they're super excited about it. And they've invested frequently up to $100 to $200 in fabric and time into this thing, right? Quilts are not cheap. And if they found an error, especially if it's a legitimate error in your quilt pattern that prevents them from making that quilt, like they have a right to be frustrated with that, right? That's a fair response. They're not being ridiculous. They're not being a grumpy customer or a Karen or something like that, right? That's a realistic response to finding out that the thing that you paid money for is not what you were expecting. That's perfectly fair. So keep that in mind when you're responding to them. You're dealing with someone who's very frustrated, and it's not necessarily at you, especially if you are in this situation where they identified something they thought was a mistake that was really just them misinterpreting the pattern. Now, obviously, we want to be doing things to our patterns to make them as readable and stupid-proof as possible, right? As immune to making mistakes as possible, because we know that our customers are frequently quilting late at night, or as a stress relief where they're not wanting to think too much about it. It's just kind of a mindless thing to do with their hands to kind of relax at the end of a long day, which is why we put so much effort into trying to make these things as readable and easy to follow as possible. So if you haven't done that and your quilt pattern is difficult to read and they misread it, even if there's not an error in the pattern, you still take some of the responsibility for that because you didn't do your due diligence to make that thing as readable as possible. But this is like, understand where they're coming from, right? Because if you understand their perspective, your response is going to be much more reasonable to them, and they're not going to escalate it, right? The last thing you want to do is go back and forth with a customer where it just keeps getting more and more antagonistic and nobody's having a good experience, because guaranteed you're going to lose that customer for life. And if you piss them off, you may actually lose additional customers because people talk, especially in the quilting industry. This is a really small world. Even though there are millions of us across the globe, this is a very close-knit community. You've got guilds, you've got people talking on online forums, and they will talk about bad pattern designers. It happens. This is why it's really important to do your due diligence and make sure that you have written a very good pattern, done the best of your abilities to make sure that it is error-free. But finally, if it does get to the point where the customer is just really being abusive, especially if you've done everything you can to try and help them, or if it wasn't your mistake to begin with, you do not need to sit there and take abuse. Nobody needs to do that. That's not reasonable for anyone. And I don't care about the saying that the customer is always right. They're not, especially in the quilting industry. And it is okay for you to stand up to yourself if they are starting to get really abusive. You shouldn't feel bad about doing that. Be professional, right? Don't start to get in the mud with them. That's not helpful either. But if they're just continuing to kind of come back to you and come after you for things that aren't not your fault or that are out of your control, and you've done everything you can to try and remedy it, feel free to just be like, look, this isn't going anywhere. I appreciate that you're frustrated. Please don't contact me anymore. This is getting to the point where it's abusive, right? And that's perfectly fine. You should not feel guilty or feel bad about doing that, because nobody is responsible for taking abuse from somebody else. At the end of the day, these are business transactions, and business is done professionally, right? So if the person on the other end is starting to get really, really unprofessional and inflammatory, you have absolutely every right to kind of cut off contact with that person, even if it is a customer of yours. Do everything you can to make it right? Start trying to de-escalate the situation, be sympathetic, own your mistakes, all of these things we've talked about. But if that's not getting you anywhere and they're just being abusive, it is a-okay to just say, nope, I'm not taking this. That's enough. Please don't contact me anymore. Alrighty, I hope you found that helpful, and I really, really hope that you never really find yourself in this situation, or if you do, it's only a couple of times. Again, there are lots and lots of resources on this channel to help you try and avoid these situations and make sure that your quilt patterns are as readable and sound as possible, especially when it comes to the quilt math. But inevitably, this stuff does still happen. You don't need to beat yourself up about it, but handling the situation, and often that first interaction with a customer who is frustrated, will set the tone for the entire interaction. And if it's handled correctly, you can actually retain that customer and they will come out having a positive experience, even if there was an issue. That's all I've got for today. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you back here next week for another episode of Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya.